Summit. We're super excited and delighted to have with us now Cameron Fox. He's the health technologies or tech leader at the World Economic Forum, and he has some other hats as well. Like most of us, we wear various hats under the same umbrella to some extent. He's also running the Global Future Council on Mental Health and the Global Future Council on Synthetic Biology within the forum. And we're also super excited to welcome him because the original and the first conversation that we had, it was not called Future Summit, it was called Innovations for Tomorrow, and this was done under the Global Shapers umbrella in Bucharest many years ago, and we were happy to also host some WEF members in Bucharest a million years ago to some extent. Now, welcome to Future Summit, Cameron, and thank you very much for taking the time.
Yeah, I'm really happy to be here. It's great to be able to sit down with you and be part of such a wonderful community. So I really appreciate the opportunity.
Lovely, thank you. So I'm gonna, slowly go towards some of the things that we talk about today, which is not just that synthetic biology, but also, what we understand by the future of healthcare. And I think, especially this year and last year, we talk a lot about healthcare. Finally, we talk more around the world about mental health. So it's not just about COVID, vaccines, and infectious diseases, but it's also about mental health. And I hope, for example, in the risk assessment that the forum does every January, we will also reach a level where mental health is also seen as a priority by more companies and leaders around the world. But coming back to the topic or the main topic that we have, which is synthetic biology, this means a million things, but to most people, it's a very puzzling thing. So I would just start with what would somebody understand by synthetic biology, and then we move forward, of course.
Sure, happy to. So I won't pretend there's an easy definition, and within the field, there's a lot of contention as to what counts as synthetic biology versus cellular engineering, systems biology, etc. But at a high level, I think that it's utilizing the tools that nature has given us to advance problems that we see as pertinent and increasingly so. So there are just, what is biology? I mean, it's molecular machines on some level, and with our ability to manipulate genes and proteins now, we can start to use a lot of those tools and to redesign cells or individual enzymes towards ends that we find beneficial for us. And I think that one big example that we've seen in the past year is the advent of mRNA vaccines. That's something that has been in the research pipeline for well over a decade, but it really stood out and I think gave people a new appreciation of what we're able to do with biology, both because of what big data is capable of, how AI is helping us with protein folding, and CRISPR, of course.
Yeah. Something that happened in the 90s, and I'm going to talk a bit about cartoons now. So in the 90s, in most of Central and Eastern Europe, we had a cartoon called Captain Planet. And this was this superhero that would take shape from a variety of kids, and he would save the planet from monstrous or monsters that were harming the planet, right? So it was a very good educational tool into making kids understand that we also need to protect the planet. So that gave us role models. Now, what is happening now is that to some extent, kids want to also become scientists and synthetic biology, but science in itself has a new superpower. What are some of the superpowers that you see that synthetic biology, something that doesn't really sound too sexy, right? Can have in the next decade? What are some top three superpowers that you think synthetic biology can bring to the table?
Well, personally, I think it's a sexy term, but I understand what you're saying. Yeah, I mean, I think that there's huge promise, first and foremost, in healthcare, of course. There are plenty of problems that, bringing synthetic biology to can help us to solve more rapidly. But one thing that I think people don't understand often enough is how applicable this is to challenges outside of biology. I mean, global warming comes to mind first and foremost, in that we could potentially use synthetic biology for carbon sequestration, to bring carbon out of the atmosphere, to produce carbon zero fuels via the biofuel revolution, to manufacture a lot of the physical inputs to our economy via biological means. So once again, preventing the deforestation, a lot of the toxic waste that comes along with a lot of manufacturing. I've seen estimates that something like 60% of the inputs to the global economy could theoretically be produced biologically. Now that's a liberal estimate, and that would be perhaps by 2050 or 2060. But it's something that we're exploring to a much greater degree. It's something that governments are clearly investing in. The private sector is quite interested in, and there's just an enormous amount of promise in so many fields.
Yeah. It feels like synthetic biology is the field of the future. I mean, we can build organisms that eat toxic chemicals in soil and water, etc. We can do so much. Does when you look at synthetic biology now, is there something different than your peers 10, 20, 30 years ago? Has something dramatically happened in the past decade, or is it just a normal
No,
growth?
I think there has been a couple of dramatic shifts, and the two that I would point to are just computational power and CRISPR are really the two things that have been quantum leaps forward in the field, because we've understood DNA for over half a century now, but the ability to have the microscopes that can look at these in very, very great detail, to have data structures that can help us understand how proteins are folding, those were huge breakthroughs. And then now with CRISPR, it gives us this ability to, as we say, cut and paste into biology in a way that we didn't have. The technology it replaced, zinc fingers, nucleases, things like this, they could very specifically manipulate genetics, but it was quite difficult to manufacture them. They were made for specific strings of nucleotides, but now we can, in theory, manipulate things with just a high school student can do it if if given the proper tools at this point.
Yeah. And that sounds good, but in the same time, it doesn't. In the same time, so what are some of the disadvantages, sorry, that you see for synthetic biology? What's the dark side of the cookie?
Well, the dark side is this democratization and how easy it is to manipulate biology now. That obviously has a lot of downsides. Anyone that wants to manufacture scary organisms can, with much less money and infrastructure than they had to in the past. And even beyond those with bad intentions, even folks with good intentions working on what's called gain of function research, where you take infectious diseases and try and make them more virulent or more deadly, with the aim of understanding how to curtail those if it happens. If that escapes from a lab, we're in a lot of trouble. And
Yeah.
that leads to the biggest issue with any biological research, which is that these are self-replicating systems. And if you introduce this into an ecosystem incorrectly, you can't turn back.
Yeah, and probably this is one of the reasons why not just security but also cybersecurity is paramount. We had in the summit in the last days a significant number of conversations about the real, or finally the real applicability of blockchain and blockchain-based security systems to some extent, and traceability. Now, since I mentioned blockchain, there's so many other technologies that combined with synthetic biology can obviously really change the world. So I'm just going to mention three: quantum computing, AI, and augmented reality. Let's just randomly pick three of them. Out of these three, what do you think, combining with synthetic biology, what do you think has the potential to actually change the world.
Yep. So I think that quantum computing, one of its biggest promises is in this term I keep mentioning, protein folding. So, most of your genes are manufacturing proteins, which are in essence molecular machines. They are very, very small pieces of engineering that are, making some reaction happen more rapidly than it would without them. But the way that they fold is an incredibly complex problem, and one that most supercomputers today still can't handle. And it's not a question of, oh, well, maybe the next supercomputer will be able to do it. It's an exponential issue that, it doesn't really matter how fast our conventional computers get. Whereas because of the way that qubits work and the possible futures it can explore, there's a lot of promise in understanding how proteins will bind to targets and what they will look like. And that could rapidly decrease the time that it takes to get from an idea to an actual drug. And that could, save billions of dollars and a lot of years for solving, lots of disease areas.
Yeah, and a
In
lot of
terms,
lives.
yeah, for AI, similar things with protein folding, but also just more generally helping us to read genomes quickly, understand what is doing what, associations therein, and that applies both to human genetic wide association studies and to rapidly sequencing a lot of the biodiversity out there, something that is becoming more and more pressing because we're losing organisms at a just tragic rate because of what we're doing to the planet.
Yeah.
Lastly, augmented reality. That's a tougher one for me to see how it's directly connected to synthetic biology. We'll have to ask Meta what their plans are there, but I can't say
Yeah.
that that's a direct connection.
I think Meta has some things to say, but what I do think in terms of AR and any type of other science is the huge educational impact it can have on ed tech in particular, so educational technology. We had a session on the metaverse in the summit, and one of the topics that we touched is that what are some of the implications of this new type of layer upon layer of digital reality around us? And one of them is actually understanding probably better how the body, or how biology works in itself. You mentioned the planet, and we are having this conversation after COP26, so after the UN meeting, and what seems to have been a productive yet disappointing to many meeting. And we almost got it, but we didn't in the end. How do you see synthetic biology as a sort of a support mechanism for protecting the planet, from ecosystems, from biodiversity, or remaking biodiversity to supporting it from the horrible decay, if you like?
Sure. So count me as someone who is disappointed but not surprised by the outcomes of COP.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of promising ways that synthetic biology can help with this. Everything from the possibility of lab-grown meats, which would be instead of growing a cow, what if you could just grow the T-bone or whatever specific muscle you want to eat there? Such an enormous percentage of arable land goes towards crops that are to feed the meat supply that we have. You have a lot of emissions from the meat itself, a lot of methane, especially a lot of environmental degradation, and the animal suffering therein. So that's a huge place that I think we'll see in the next decade or so. It's still very, very expensive to do, but I think the cost will come down there. There's the potential for carbon capture, like I talked about earlier, either via algae, bacteria, yeast that are absorbing carbon, or even biomineralization, the process by which animals can turn carbon plus calcium into calcium carbonate. You see that in all shelled creatures. That is a way to sequester carbon that is going to put it into rock that will not go back into the atmosphere for millions of years. There's the bioenergy that I spoke about, which has been a promise for a while that hasn't come to fruition, but will at some point, I think. And then lastly, you talked about biodiversity. I think this is tough because, the effects that we're having on the climate are not going to be easily remediated by, altering one gene, altering one specific organism. We just cannot possibly understand all of the intricate balances that are present in the ecosystem. But I won't pretend it's not fun to say that we might bring a woolly mammoth back to life. These are very interesting possibilities. If I
That
don't
would
think
definitely
particularly
be
pertinent.
fun.
It sure would. Yeah.
Would make somebody a lot of money. I mean, I would pay to see one. But in the same time, that opens. I mean, if we get a mammoth back, we can get other stuff back. I'm not talking about dinosaurs. I really don't believe we can do that. But there's other species that we have lost not even in the last 100 years. In the last 50 years, we've lost so many species that make our planet whole to some extent. So biodiversity is a mechanism that requires most of the parts or all of the parts. Now, you talked about climate change and meat, and that takes me to a question related to plant-based food and the relation that this would have and has with synthetic biology. I do think we live in a sort of a plant revolution. We had someone from Green Biz in the US, Teresa Lieb, in the summit, and she talked a lot about this plant revolution, let's call it, or I would call it. But eating more plants or replacing more of the meat would also require a lot of land. So it's not a trade-off that we eat more plants and that saves the planet, right? So there's also
yes, but I would push back there just because of, if you look at the efficiency, so you have ultimately all the food we eat is energy derived from the sun, of course.
Yeah.
When you get that from a plant, well, that's, the energy goes from sun to plant to human. When you have an intermediary of, say, a pig, sun, plant, pig, human, you're going to need, I think it's something like 20 calories of a plant per 1 calorie that you can extract from, a chicken. And that only goes up the larger the animal you have is. So you're right that you're still going to need to grow that plant somewhere, but the amount of land you need to extract the calories needed for humans is vastly less than if you're using that to grow food to feed an animal that then feeds a human.
Yeah. You mentioned pig, and I cannot not go into that conversation. I know you recently wrote about the already famous pig kidney transplant using a genetically modified pig as a donor. I mean, this opens a world in which we are already, but it enlarges the world of animal to human donation in a world where in an organ market, let's call it, which is both very gray and dark, or black market, but also very small. I mean, there's a huge need. How do you see this? I mean, let's take a 5-year, 10-year approach. Do you see that we would actually grow pigs or other animals for that?
I do. Now, there's a lot of work left to be done, and while I was as excited as anyone to see this happen, there are a lot of caveats that we need to talk about. One, the person who accepted this donation, it was a patient who was already brain dead, was completely being kept alive by life support, and it was something that the family consented to, and she had consented to ahead of time. They did not implant it in her body, but attached it to the outside of her thigh so that they could monitor it. It worked for the 72 hours or so that they had her hooked up to it before they took it off life support. But the risk of rejection is not only in that first, window of a couple of days. Rejection can happen later on. And so we're going to need to do a lot more work to make sure that this continues to be accepted and not, attacked by the human immune system. The way that we were able to do that was via CRISPR and eliminating a specific carbohydrate, alpha-gal, which is the main reason that you can't do cross-species transplants.
Yeah,
I think there's a lot of promise here, though.
There was a lot of promise, or I'd say dreams, a couple of years ago about 3D printing organs, and I mean it works with ears and some other parts of the body, but it doesn't really yet, at least. work with the kidney, for example. But this would be in the future a way to build organs if we build them in other animals, a rather non-ethical perspective in the same time.
Yes, there are ethical issues there, but I mean, I think that the trade-off is quite low, especially considering the, in my opinion, just heinous way that we treat most of the animals that we eat. You know, even if we were to be growing animals for every transplant needed on Earth, that is a tiny fraction of the animals that we're currently raising for human consumption. And so while I hope that it puts more pressure and cognizance on what factory farming is and how we should do that better, I don't think that the ethical worries are quite as well placed there. These are things we should talk about. And I think that we will eventually get to a place where, as you said, we can 3D print an organ outside of an animal. But for now, the idea of printing a kidney with, you know, the superstructure being an entire animal, that is a hell of a lot better than all of the people that are unable to get these transplants or have to deal with dialysis for years.
I think some of my vegan colleagues appreciate this standpoint as well. Now, speaking of time and you know, moving forward in time with the planet and the people, we do live longer, and that's good, right? I mean, in perspective, we're getting to 10 billion any day now. I remember when I was in school, we were 6 billion, and now we're almost 8 billion. So, you know, there's a lot of death rates are to some extent decreasing, life expectancy is going up. How do you see the future from this perspective, with a lot of older people going towards 80, 90, 100, 120, etc.? And what are some of the challenges and opportunities in healthcare for this, what we call, you know, gray economy or silver economy? Well, I don't know what comes when you're 100. I don't know, like super gray, super silver economy.
Right. I mean, you know, it's obviously a positive trend and speaks to our ability to, you know, manipulate biology or understand biology and just greater, you know, average wealth. But yeah, there are a lot of problems with the way that we're seeing demographic shifts. I mean, Japan is the best example, obviously. They're aging faster than any other population. And that combined with low birth rates, it's concerning. It's something we're going to have to figure out because we obviously cannot keep growing forever. But solutions are tough because we're going to continue to need a larger workforce to take care of these folks. That diverts away from other parts of the economy. And it's just difficult to see how we're going to do that without really leveraging, you know, digital technologies, the increasing capability of AI to help us out. But I won't pretend that solves all of our problems. You know, like just the loneliness that a lot of these folks experience is quite tough.
There's this loneliness pandemic that seems to be engulfing us in the era of being hyper connected. There's a new loneliness pandemic combined with the depression pandemic that we're also seeing. I know you're also working in mental health, and you know, I wanted to ask you how you feel, not how you feel, but you know, looking back in the past 2 years. How did you see the changes in mental health, and do you see are there rays of hope around the next years?
I do think there are. I mean, obviously, the world has suffered an enormous amount in the past couple of years, but one silver lining of that is that I think there's an increasing cognizance and awareness of mental health as an issue in a way that there wasn't before COVID, and it's unfortunate that to reach that point, we had to go through such a tragedy and have so many more people experience it first or second hand. But I sincerely hope that you know, shifts the conversation and makes us focus on mental health as something that is as important as physical health. I also think we've seen a lot of innovation and taking down of regulatory barriers. You know, a lot of, you know, telehealth across states or these apps that are now available to help you out, and that are being enabled by, just the fact that we had to change things rapidly once we couldn't be seen in person. So I do think that there is hope for the future, but there's a long way to go, certainly.
Yeah. And you mentioned the future, two final questions to some extent. One, the World Economic Forum is well known for, Davos and then the various global communities, etc., but also a reference point on trends. So if you were to pick, let's say, a top 3, top 5 trends in health or healthcare that you see really important in the next 3-5 years, what would those be?
The next 3 to 5 years, let's see. I mean, I have to put climate change there. I think that will be the issue of our lifetimes. In the next, it will be more of an issue as we go forward. Could very well see 1 billion climate refugees by 2050. But even in the next 5 years, we're going to continue to see more wildfires, hurricanes, all of the things that we're all cognizant of at this point. Urbanization is a trend that I think we need to address. I think that it was in 2005 that for the first time, 50% of humanity was living in cities. We're going to be at around 70% by 2050. And while there are a lot of benefits to that, we're seeing, huge upticks in rates of respiratory disease, problems. Excuse me.
No worries.
So I think that we need to address urbanization and how we do that properly. We spoke about demographic shifts. I think that that's important both in terms of aging populations and where most of the world will be. China was the most populous nation until a few years ago. Now it's India. And you see this curve as nations move from low to middle income, where they have rapid explosions of population. And by 2050, we're going to see most of the world being in sub-Saharan Africa, with Nigeria quite possibly being the most populous nation on Earth. So we need to understand what those trends will mean. And then lastly, I would say that the last biggest trend I would point out is digitization and AI in healthcare. These are things that we're going to have to solve, like I said, if we want to address a world that is growing rapidly with a healthcare system that is not growing as rapidly and cannot be expected to.
And then final question about 2022, which is like tomorrow to some extent. What is something that excites you in the world of healthcare next year, and what is something that scares you, or the highest risk, or however you want to put it in healthcare? So the good and the bad.
The good, I hope to see vaccination rates worldwide continue to go up. I hope that, high-income countries will do more to deliver vaccines to those that need them. And the flip side of that is I hope that we don't continue to see the retreat into nationalism that we saw during COVID. And, just the breakdown of supply chains, of international trust and sharing of things. We could very well see a world where we were broken up into a much more siloed globe and are reticent to help each other out as much as we used to be. That, combined with geopolitical tensions, especially between the US and China, could go one of two ways. I just hope to see more cooperation and a cognizance that this doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. We can do good things together without necessarily, harming either of these superpowers.
Yeah, it's most of the times win-lose game. But let's hope we find we're on the winners' side to some extent in the future. We had a lovely chat with Cameron Fox from the World Economic Forum, and also some other chats and conversations in the summit related to this topic, especially the one with Mircea Iliescu from the University of Cambridge on genomic revolutions, which was quite spectacular. Now, thank you very much, Cameron, for taking the time. And I hope, and we hope, we have a safer 2022 and beyond, of course. We're looking forward to what happens next year in Davos, and looking forward to the risk analysis, which I'm sure it will include even at a higher level infectious diseases It's top 5 this year, but I think it's going to go up at top 3. But we'll see what happens. Thank you so much, and have a lovely day ahead.
Really appreciate it, Cyprian. Bye-bye.